Ladies and gentlemen, there's a lot of genres of vampire movies that we've talked about through the years, but one that hasn't really been explored. Maybe there might have been a Jonah Hex comic book, or maybe a Tomb of Dracula crossover, or whatever. Western style movies with vampirism or the undead. Now, this movie was put together by the Dean couple, Edward and oh my God, I always forget her name. Let me hold on a second. Mildred Dean. Mildred wrote this one, and her husband Edward directed it. It's Curse of the Undead. Great title. But this is very interesting. It's a universal release, but not really that Hammer style vampire movie you know about. Now, this starred B movie stalwarts Eric Fleming, Michael Pate, and Caitlin Crowley. And our good friend of the channel, John Walco, did the request. Thank you, John. Always good to talk on your behalf of your love for these type of movies. Now, in this film, in an old west town, young girls are dying of a mysterious wasting disease. Dr. John Carter and his daughter Dolores have been tending to patients for hours, but just lost another. After preacher Dan Young's night-long vigil, Cora looks like she will survive. During breakfast with Cora's parents, however, they hear Cora scream. Cora is found dead in a bed, her window open. As he kneels to pray, Dan notices two small bloody holes in Cora's throat. Now, returning to a ranch, Doc Carter finds his son Tim extremely upset after the actions of their neighbor Buffer, including damming a stream on the Carter ranch and having his men assault anyone who complains. Doc drives back into town to see the local sheriff. The sheriff's discussion with Buffer proves unsuccessful, however, and a black-clad stranger follows Doc Carter's buckboard. By the time he gets home, the Doc is dead, his throat bloody. Grief is stricken. Tim snaps after learning a fence has been torn down and cattle are escaping. Convinced Buffer is responsible, Tim goes after him but is killed by Buffer. Dolores hangs up gun wanted posters all over town, offering $100 to anyone who can gun down the murderer. After a stranger promises to kill Buffer, one of the rancher's men shoots at the stranger. As the stranger leaves, Buffer sacks the man despite his insisting he hit his target dead center. Now, the stranger, calling himself Drake Roby, arrives at the Carter Ranch. He reacts to a thorn cross and a button worn by Dan. When asked, Dan says it was an ordination gift, the thorn coming from the site of the crucifixion. Despite Dan's protest, Dolores hires Roby. He moves into the house, and that night, he sneaks into Dolores' room and drinks some of her blood. Really sucks it for sure. Great scene. The next morning, Dan finds Dolores looking tired, complaining of cold, and very compliant. Dolores and Dan spend the day looking for her father's will. They find a map showing the property had once belonged to a Spanish family, the Robles, sold it suffering some kind of tragedy. Dan takes the paperwork, including a locked safety box, home with him to continue the search. When Dan leaves, Roby comes to see Dolores, and he talks to Dolores into hiring as a night range rider, so he can keep an eye on Buffer and his men. She offers him the cemetery caretaker's cottage to stay in if he doesn't mind being near the dead. Roby says, "The dead don't bother me, it's the living that causes me trouble." Great line, by the way. At home, Dan knocks over the safety box, cracking it open. Within it, he finds the 1860 diary of Don Miguel Robles, the former owner of the land. According to the diary, Don Robles sent his son Drago to Madrid on business without his new bride Isabella. Isabella turned to Drago's brother Roberto for companionship. When Drago returns and learns of the relationship, he killed his brother with a dagger, and distraught, Drago later commits suicide with the same dagger. Over the next 6 months, mysterious deaths of young girls take place. One night, Don Robles hears Isabella scream and goes to her room, finding a man bent over, Drago Robles, who fled, leaving Isabella drained of blood. To end the curse, Don Robles plunged a silver dagger through Drago's heart as he lay in his coffin. After confessing his actions to the priest, and he learned a wooden stake is needed to destroy a vampire. He returns but finds the coffin empty except for the dagger. Hidden within the diary is a photograph of Drago Robles. It is Drake Roby in Spanish clothing. Now, as Dan reads Don Robles' diary, Roby summons the sleeping Dolores to him, but is interrupted by the sheriff. After hearing the sheriff denounce him to Dolores, Roby follows him back to town and kills him with his bite. As Dan starts back to the house after examining the body, he is followed by Roby. In a panic, he races for the church. Roby enters the shadow of a church cross and flees. Back in his house, Dan is confronted by Roby, who defends his actions, protesting, "What I am is not my own choice. You should pity me, not judge me in my torment. Do you think I wanted this?" before attacking Dan. Now Dan's housekeeper interrupts the attack, and Roby flees with his photograph and a Rancho Robles map. Now when Dan tells Dolores about the evening's events, she doesn't believe him. Dan takes her to the family crypt to find Drago Robles' empty coffin, except for a silver dagger. When Dan insists they look in every coffin for Roby, including his father and brother, Dolores explodes and throws him out. After Dan leaves, they get a court order to do so. Dolores, apparently weakened by blood loss, her anger at Dan and Roby's hypnotic influence, collapses. Roby emerged from a Carter coffin to feed from Dolores before carrying her back home. After Dolores awakens, Roby shows her the Rancho Robles map. The stream Buffer has been damming is on her property, not his. Now Roby goes into town to show the map to Buffer, who angrily shoots Roby. Roby fires back, killing Butler, and walks away unscathed. Hard to kill a gunslinging vampire. Now, the plot in this is saying that a person that kills himself can become a vampire. This is going to come up pretty soon. Now, Roby reports back to Dolores when she sees a bullet hole in his vest. He claims his cigar case stopped Buffer's bullet. Roby learns that Dan is heading for the county seat to get a court order to open the graves. Roby promises to join with Dolores to stop him. Warned by Dolores' housekeeper, Dan makes preparation. Roby heads for town to talk Dan into getting that court order, but Dan will not be stopped. They challenge each other in a shootout, and Dan fires first, just as Dolores arrives. Roby collapses and disintegrates into dust, leaving only his empty clothes behind. Now, this makes absolutely no sense, because usually with a vampire, everything burns. But anyway, Dan walks over to Roby's clothes and picks up his bullet, which has a thorn cross on it. Now, Eric Fleming plays Preacher Dan, Michael Pate, or Pat, as Drake Roby, Kathleen Crowley as Dolores Carter, the great John Hoyt as Dr. Carter, Bruce Gordon as Buffer, great name, very Godfather life, Edward Binns as Sheriff, Jimmy Murphy as Tim Carter, Helen Klebe as Dora, Jay Adler as Bartender, Eddie Parker as Henchman, also known as Edwin Parker, John Truax as Henchman number 2, Frankie Van as Henchman number 3, and Rush Williams as Henchman number 4. Now, according to critics, Curse of the Undead deliberately sets itself out as different, not only because it's a horror western, but because it returns to European vampire folklore rather than relying on Universal's mythology or the Hammer version of Dracula, which had been released the previous year, although it did keep the idea of Roby transforming into a bat, which is a cinematic creation, not a part of European folklore. Now, Universal was using this as the B feature to re-release of The Mummy back, I think, in the 60s. Now, I saw this, The Mummy, and this in the same poster. It's quite interesting because mummies have nothing to do with vampires, but had a lot to do with the undead. Now, this one, Roby's a vampire not because he was a victim of another vampire, but because he committed the mortal sin of suicide. Well into the 19th century, of course, suicides were buried at crossroads to prevent them from turning as vampires. Because of this, none of Roby's victims will be returning from the dead. Also, unlike the film iconology of the previous 50-odd years, Roby is not incinerated by exposure to the daylight. The pre-cinema vampires were perfectly capable of walking in the sunlight. The final method of Roby's destruction is definitely unique, but appropriate for both the myth and the setting. Preacher Dan's thorn cross, supposedly originating from the site of the crucifixion, is destructive to the vampire both because of its form, a cross, and its source, Calvary. Its supernatural powers are made clear by the fact that it survives being shot from a gun. A normal thorn would have been destroyed. Placing the cross on a bullet used in the old-fashioned Western shootout simply makes it part of the setting. Now, according to sources, Curse of the Dead started as a gag idea by the dean, the husband and wife deans, and Universal International producer Joseph Gershenson heard about the idea from his wife and quickly phoned Edward Dean. He said, "Hey, smartass, the good stuff you don't give us, I want to make this picture." According to early studio announcement, the film was intended as a satire of the vampire theme set in the Old West, but became a more dramatic presentation as was. Now, Dennis Schwartz of Oz's World Movie Reviews rated the film a B-, calling it a gimmicky B-horror western that soon wears thin. Dave Sinelar of Fantastic Movie Musings and Ramblings called it the most successful merging of the Western horror genres, and it's not too much, while also criticizing the film's soundtrack and some of the performances. TV Guide awarded the film 1 out of 4 stars, calling the film mediocre. Now, it's got a Blu-ray release and a DVD release, and it was also shown on the Me TV show Svengoolie on June 19, 2021. Now, comparison westerns, according to Wikipedia and IMDb, include Billy the Kid versus the Vampire, Jesse James Meets Frankenstein's Daughter. Everybody's seen that, of course. Near Dark, the Adrian Parstar modern movie, and Sundown, the Vampire in Retreat. Now, I have not seen this whole movie, but I can tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. It is an untapped genre involving westerns and horror movies. Now, Sundown, the Vampire Retreat, the western comedy has, get this, David Carradine, Bruce Campbell, Morgan Brittany, and Deborah Foreman. Now, that's not a B movie plot. I don't know what is. But I'd like to see a genre of vampire westerns. But the Billy the Kid versus Dracula, you're talking about a crappy movie, ladies and gentlemen. And that starred John Carradine, of all things. And not Chuck Connors, but Chuck Courtney. Not the poor man's... one as way. Now, this was part of a double bill that was later got like Billy the Kid versus Dracula, and again Jesse James Meets Frankenstein's Daughter. So public domain works good. But if you could do a movie involving Jonah Hex, the original intention, not the DC Legends of Tomorrow, and Morbius, have a crossover DC Marvel, that would be great. I paid money to see that. Maybe put like Man-Thing or Swamp Thing in it. So basically, you could do the Morbius or the Tomb of Dracula, Kid Colt joining up to battle against evil homesteaders or something like that. That would be a tremendous movie. But for what it is, ladies and gentlemen, you gotta love those B movies because they only took a few days to make, and it must have been doing something right because 63 years later, one of the followers of our channel wanted me to talk about it, and I respect movies like this because Universal Monsters gave us a lot of pleasure through the years, and there was always a sexual kind of impact to it. There was like chasing women, or basically a man being like a strong man being, showing strength and all that. But I would never think a silver bullet with a thorn from cavalry on it. Takes a lot of thinking, and that sounds like a parody, but it's not. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, if you like what we're doing here with our kind of horror vintage B-movie podcast, let us know with a like, comment, subscribe. And John, keep the requests coming. And a lot of people have never heard these movies, so I hope it's information for you out there. Like me and John, we have a big love of the B-movies and the Hammer movies. Check them out if you can find them. And it's got to be late night, like 4 o'clock in the morning, in between CBS News at sunrise and the last episode of, I don't know, Stargate SG-1 or something. Something CHTH would show on the weekend. Thanks for listening. Bye.